I think we'll get started. So we haven't even started yet, and we already lost one panelist, which is a bit concerning. But hopefully he will still be able to join us. So welcome everybody to the second, or one of the second to last panels on a Friday afternoon before a long weekend. So I commend you all for being here and for showing up for this important discussion. And we will do our best to keep you engaged and in active listening mode. Our topic is a safe space to create how platforms are approaching minors' privacy. So this will be a very practical look at what the considerations are that must be top of mind when creating and maintaining a space for children and teens in the online world. My name is Natascha Gerlach. I'm the Director for Privacy and Data Policy at the Center for Information Policy Leadership, or CIPL for short, here in Brussels. And I will be introducing my wonderfully diverse panel, although we lost one, so but it's still okay. I'm starting with you, Simon. To my right is Simon Wibert, the Head of Policy and Research at Internet Matters, a UK-based NGO engaged in providing online child safety advice to different stakeholders in the process. And before that, Simone, you were a senior policy and public affairs analyst at the UK's Children's Commissioner's Office. I have that right. Okay, great. I'm happy to have you with us. And then next to me on my other side is Caroline Golding, who's the data protection officer at TikTok. And before joining TikTok in 2020, I think you spent a good part of your career at LinkedIn, also in the position of DPO, so lots of experience there. And then on the other sofa over there, we have Darragh McCashin, who's an assistant professor at the School of Psychology at Dublin City University. And he's, and this is a very long title, he's the chair of the Observatory on Cyberbullying, Cyberhate, and Online Harassment in the Anti-Cyberbullying Center. And Darragh, from our preparatory calls, I understand that you also research more broadly in the area of digital mental health of children and youth and young people. So lots of expertise on this panel. We are missing James Brunger, who's Associate General Counsel at SNAP, but hopefully he will still join, as I said. One housekeeping note. We will leave time at the end of the panel for questions, so note your questions down and then come to the mic later on. And with that, I will get started. Just to set the scene a little bit, we can probably all agree that in the digital world, we have a lot of benefits to all of us, and it provides a lot of benefits to all of us. Access to people, to resources, and markets around the world, and most of us are in fact embracing the technology and the novelties presented to us at ever-increasing speeds. I heard Google CEO Sundar Pichai speak the other day about platform shifts, and he noted that it was the internet first, then mobile, and now it's AI. And I am old enough to remember all of these inflection points in our daily lives, but our society as a whole has without doubt been moving more and more into the digital realm. But we also have to be clear when we think about that, that today 1 in 3 internet users is a child, so an individual under the age of 18, so 1 in 3. And that means that in the digital environment, it is now, this is a fundamental part of especially also our children's lives. It shapes their social lives, their education, their information resource, it's their shopping mall, and it is also their playground. I noticed that one of the other panels on children and youth privacy yesterday had the statistic that 94% of under 18-year-olds play computer games, and of that 60% play online, and 52% every day. So, and while I just admitted being old enough to remember a world without everyone having at least a personal computer at their disposal or internet connectivity or a mobile phone, and I actually remember that a phone booth is not just for Superman to change in, the next generation does not necessarily have that context. Children and teens are growing up directly with, but also in technology, and we have to recognize that when we talk about children's data protection and creating an online environment for children. There may be developmental costs when we exclude children, for instance, from the online environment, when they are deprived of certain knowledge or skills that their peers can access or develop. And so it's not just a matter of what we're talking about today. It's not just a matter of shutting children out to protect them, but by turning off the mobile phone or taking the tablet away, but instead protecting them in the digital environment, allowing them to thrive in a safe and appropriate space. And this shift from looking at the topic in the context of just safety towards carving out an appropriate space for children and teens is driven to a large degree by this concept of the best interest of the child that we've all heard many times mentioned. This comes from Article 3 of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which established this principle and stipulates very broadly that in every law, public or private initiative and otherwise, I love this, in every problematic situation, the best interest of the child must be given preeminent consideration. But we look at this, of course, through a global lens, because the internet is global. And cultural and legal differing views about children's privacy, how to define their best interest, and how their online experience should be shaped and overseen are inevitably different. And I would like to spend some time today at the beginning of our discussion teasing out what we are actually talking about when we have to consider the best interest of the child. What does this entail? How has it been evolving? And what do we mean when we say age appropriate? And Simone, you do have extensive experience. I've done a lot of research in this, and you advise on this every day. Can you kick us off here? And of course, the rest of the panel, please chime in where you find time.
Absolutely, thanks. Yeah, so what we're talking about here is a move from safety to something that's beyond safety, whether that we talk about agency or well-being. There's different ways of thinking about this. Now, we have to be clear, speaking from a child rights perspective, that safety is absolutely critically important, obviously. You know, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child applies online as it applies offline, and protection from harm is a key consideration in that. But I guess there's three reasons why I think a single-minded focus on safety at all costs is the wrong approach. So I guess the first reason is that a focus on safety tends to focus on the most serious harms you can imagine. Child sexual abuse material, grooming, that kind of thing. If you think of the online safety bill in the UK, it's very much primarily focused at the illegal content. But what we know when we speak to parents and children and young people day in, day out, is those aren't the top of mind concerns they have about being online. They are concerns. It is important that we tackle those things, but they're not top of mind. And I think this focus on safety tends to draw us into those most serious of harms, rather than things like, how much am I spending online? How much time am I spending online? The fact I'm being bullied. These are the things that young people think about day in, day out. So I think that's the first reason. The second reason is that there are, of course, considerations beyond safety. You know, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child is very clear that safety is one consideration, but as you mentioned, Natascha, the best interest of the child, they encompass things so much broader than protection from harm: association, expression, information, and of course, privacy. So we have to balance all of those things. If you kick children off being online, then you are depriving them of rights in certain areas. And finally, I guess, even if we, you know, as we should really care about safety, it can be self-defeating if you then talk to young people in a particular way and you treat them in a sort of a particular way. If you kick young people off platforms from a parent's point of view, they're probably less likely to talk to you about what's going on online. And that's one of the single most protective factors for children. So in reality, you're not setting them up to succeed in life. Particularly at some point, they will be online and they just won't have your help. So what we've tried to the shift I think we're trying to make in policy terms is the move from this single-minded focus on a very narrow view of safety to reflect all the reasons that young people are online, all the kinds of activities they get and all the benefits they get. And that means you have to approach it in a slightly different way, I think.
Thanks, Simone and Natascha, for the introduction to kick us off. Just before we dive into the topic, and I'm really excited to be here, and definitely everyone sitting in the audience, I'm sure, is a very passionate professional this late on a Friday afternoon after 3 days of the conference. But just to take one brief moment to explain the role of the DPO in the age-appropriate design and implementation world that we're going to, dive into today. As was mentioned in the introduction, I joined TikTok over 3 years ago, and yesterday was the anniversary of the GDPR. It's also the 5th anniversary of the role of the DPO under the GDPR, and so it's quite bespoke to every organization. And just very briefly, the way we've set it up in TikTok is there's a separate privacy legal function and a separate DPO function. And so the DPO is an independent advisor to the business, also often championing the voice of the user due to the nature of the role. We're very attuned to the data subject, and often as well as the point of contact for regulators bringing in their views. So just to kind of ground us in that reality of when we're advising, when we're speaking about age-appropriate design, the DPO is coming at it from that angle, as well as monitoring compliance with some of the legislation and guidance that we're going to touch on later.
Thank you for that. As in that role, I imagine you talk to, for instance, Simone, you may talk to people like Darragh as well, in order to understand. It's a very broad concept when we say best interest of the child. It could mean different things in different cultures, to your peers even, within companies, within families, it may mean a different thing. So where do you go when you start to define this? What is your touch point there?
Sure. So indeed, it's we know now where it's originated from, but it's it's the standard is kind of being interpreted. There's best interests of the child assessments being, they're evolving, like the line of thinking and how companies approach them is evolving. It's to take a step back. It's a really huge, responsibility where an organization is trying to balance, the need to protect that Simone mentioned, as well as the need to empower. And so I think in the starting point really is bringing from a company perspective, taking on as many views as possible. So it's a very multidisciplinary, cross-functional effort. I think it was touched on that, the overlap between safety and privacy has gotten, bigger and bigger over time. And so there's a kind of a unique balancing approach needs to be taken, because as well there can be conflicts depending on...
Sure. And I think when we will touch a bit on the conflicts in terms also not just within this concept of best interest of the child, but maybe also within legislation, for instance, within countries, and because we are talking globally. But before that, I would like to expand a little bit on this idea of best interest of the child. And in order for us to understand what that is, we also have to understand what risks are we talking about? What is the risk taxonomy here that we have to consider specifically, that is specific to children and youth data protection, how it has or may have evolved over time. And when you read, for instance, the UK's age-appropriate design code, apparently kids describe the internet as nosy and rude and a bit freaky, and clearly those were some very well articulated and very polite UK kids. But just this week, the US Surgeon General Vivek Murthy also issued an advisory warning that the impact of social media on adolescents is not fully understood yet, but that there are indicators that excessive social media use can have a risk of harm to the mental health of adolescents. And there was a very interesting article in the New York Times as well on where they took reactions from children in New York in different schools. Also in light of the recent developments in the US on tackling cyber media. And this was very interesting. It's a very interesting article because when it came to risks, such as in the online world, children were actually quite aware of what they are facing there, such as cyberstalking or bullying. But they are also they were really aware of the benefits that social media brings to them. And there was a consensus, and I found that interesting, that social media is something that is inevitable in their generation. It is something that they have to have. This is how they participate. And so, so there is an awareness, and maybe more so than we tend to give credit for. But of course, this has to be understood also in my mind, in the context of children's developmental stage and the comprehension of the full context that they may not have. And so I would like for us to delve into a little bit the risk taxonomy that we have to consider, and so risks posed by whom and to whom. And Darragh, I think you are well placed to kick us off in that discussion.
Sure, thank you. That's a lot of concepts and a lot of words for a Friday evening. But I always kind of say to myself and colleagues, just go back to your 10-year-old self, your 12-year-old self. How would you be explaining these kind of balancing acts to your younger self, such that you would be able to understand this kind of risk matrix, I suppose. And it's very, very hard. Side note, the best use of ChatGPT that I've heard of recently is somebody putting in their policy into the search and say, rewrite this to me as a 7-year-old and see if it makes sense. But however, and we're always going to be talking about how we approach the balancing act, knowing that we can never eradicate risk in the first instance. I come back to the phrase, what's the least worst option when we're discussing, on the one hand, benefits, and on the other hand, harms. Some of the harms, I suppose they relate to certain ideas like, can we actually apply informed consent? Does a child actually know what the intricacies of this platform or service actually are in the context of either their thriving and their wellness, or perhaps their susceptibility to harm. And what's very interesting, it's interesting that you raised the point about children being quite discerning, and I think it's often a myth that they are afraid of potential bad actors, whereas in actual fact, children are very inquisitive and will actively question where there is good parental relationships when they come across something that does not make them feel well. I think the EU Kids Online project certainly found that as well. Whilst a lot of children came across something they didn't like, they were also able to question it as well. From a psychological perspective, we have to, of course, think about the different developmental stages. And what that actually means in terms of their ability to consent, the role of the parent within this, and then how that does or does not work cross-culturally. So there's always a lot going on. And the most important thing is having the voice of the child at the table. In psychology, we've seen service user movements across many areas of society with lots of successes, but having the child's voice at the table is often a real challenge as well, and I know that's something that we're all passionate about. How can we actually co-design, particularly with new regulatory frameworks and new design codes as well? How can we bring that 10 and 12-year-old to the table to try and advance the conversation? So a few ideas there.
And Darragh, just picking up on that piece around co-creating or co-designing with younger people, TikTok has invested heavily in that space. You know, it is enshrined in the UK's age-appropriate design code. It's also in the DPC's fundamentals and other areas. And I would totally echo the sentiment that the younger users can actually often be more aware of how the ecosystem works. This is something the Norwegian Data Protection Authority mentioned on a panel here earlier in the week, of the need to explain to users, how the ecosystem works, and that's something we saw, that the younger users knew more than their parents when it came to that, and it came out through the research.
It's so when in that New York Times article, for instance, there was this perception also that the children found it interesting that this was directed at them when they saw that, for instance, their grandmother spends their day looking at funny cat videos on social media all day. So why is this particularly something that concerns us? And one thing that I found really interesting, one of the students said toward certain the ideas of certain bans of social media was, why are they banning our social life? So they've internalized this in terms of their social interaction is being an extension of them, and I think that's exactly. I think that's very true, and I mean we've all experienced that. I think you had this anecdote with your friend's child who came to visit you, and that was an aha moment in generational differences.
Made me feel old. So the house phone rang. I was giving away my drum kit. I thought I was going to be a rock star, but now I just talk about mental health. And I was giving this drum kit away to a 7-year-old. The house phone rang, and he said, "What's that?" And he was perplexed by this thing attached to the wall. And it's just, we get these little windows sometimes into a process or lack of kind of thought about something and what that says about how the child sees the world, and the world includes social media, whereas from other generations it's the world within which social media plays a part, and that's a very different kind of separation. And we've seen this with the screen time debate, for example. So as far as I'm concerned, the best evidence from the likes of Oxford Internet Institute, there is no causal link between excessive screen time and well-being, even though our working assumption and feeling is perhaps otherwise. It's all about the contextual factors. And many parents will speak to this, even though they'll be quite concerned with it. That's not to say there aren't subgroups that are perhaps more at risk. The COVID was an interesting insight into how social media didn't break the world, how technology kept education going. It was the least worst option. And so the natural experiment that was the pandemic also gives us some things to think about, I suppose.
This role of parents that we're picking up on is absolutely fascinating, I think. So I think there really is something in an obvious generational divide between the kind of familiarity young people have with platforms and certain functionality and certain tech compared to their parents. We often use the phrase that children are digital natives compared to their parents. They just intuitively know how to use tech. And therefore, the question is, what's the role of the parent in that context? But I guess what we hear a lot about at Internet Matters, we focus a lot on parents, is that actually, although parents don't have that intuitive knowledge of, or the intimate knowledge of particular functionality, particular apps, what they do have that children don't have always is an ability to help, an ability to know how to respond in certain situations, to have the maturity to know that if I've experienced this interaction, this is how I could react. Like, children can't always put into context what they see online if it's inappropriate content. They don't know how to respond to harmful interactions. And that's when the role of the parent is absolutely critical to come in. And it's why the message we have often for parents is, you do not need to know to play a role in this space. You do not need to know the ins and outs of every single app that your child is using. What you do need to be able to have is an open and honest conversation with your child. So it's a delicate balancing act, this conversation, acknowledging that we would love parents to have more knowledge of what the specifics of what children are doing online, but in terms of that dialogue, that you don't need to know everything to make a difference in the space. And I'm really glad we're having this conversation, partly because I think the role of parents in regulation and legislation is kind of there by, it's not there at all, basically. It's missing in action. And I think, that's a really interesting aspect to think about, because it's obviously children don't exist in vacuums. They exist in families, they exist in schools. I don't think that's reflected in often the way we talk about children and their lives online.
I'd love to, pick up on that, because I think many of you who've probably attended other sessions at the conference, there's been some controversial comments around, parental controls. One such being that they're used to spy on children. So again, it's going back to the debate on kind of agency versus, the level of protection. And just on that, TikTok has, a family pairing, parental control, where they can link an account and actually take certain actions. But it's really important to note that there's a dashboard, and that's visible to the younger user, to the child, so they know they have to agree to it, but they also know what actions might be taken. One such action, to go back to screen time, and the New York Times article is there's a screen time dashboard. So the parent or guardian can review how much time their teens have spent on the app. They can restrict who can send messages to the child. They can, decide whether the account is set at private or public. So all of those are one aspect. But then to pick up on the other element, which is other research has shown that parents sometimes don't want to be told how to parent, and they're resistant, rightfully so, to a company maybe telling them, but they still want sufficient information. And so as such, we've had a lot of partnerships with academia and with research organizations and so on how to communicate, and one such output being collaborating with younger users on a guide for how they want their parents or guardians to talk to them, to trust them, to have the conversation and not shy away from not having the conversation.
I think that's something that many of the large platforms are doing in various forms. And when it comes to these kinds of parental controls, I think when we had the prep call, what we were saying is that parents shouldn't be helicoptering, but the child knowing more about the technology doesn't absolve the parent from having to parent, basically. And I think that's quite true. But the key to me there is transparency, and for them to work together, for the child to know. And sorry to keep coming back to the New York Times article, but there was, for instance, one child who told the reporter that he helped, his parents to set these up. So they did this together, and I think that's the ideal way. But perhaps just to go back to my initial question briefly on the risk. And how do we define this risk taxonomy? Because I think there's a little more to it. Because intuitively, we think it's protecting the child from the outside, from predators, grooming, etc. And of course, it is that. But there are other dangers. There are, for instance, there's risk regarding their peers, or coming from their peers, and we touched on privacy vis-a-vis their children. Darragh, what is your research in there, and can you elaborate on that a bit?
And there's huge data sets that speak to the fact that a large proportion of, for example, abuse, cyber abuse, bullying is peer-to-peer, and we always say to young people, it's not as if that young person wakes up saying, I'm going to be a bully today, either in person or online. The kind of ecosystem that they inhabit can lead to different sorts of pathways that, from an adult's perspective, this is a crime, this is bullying, this is unacceptable, and we're going to design our policy speak our way out of this. Whereas for the young person's experience, it might not be seen as such. The other thing that we often think about is this binary thing of perpetrator-victim, whereas it's actually far more complex as well. We can have a person being a victim in the first instance and then turning into a perpetrator, also without realizing the role of the parent within all of this as well, in either interrupting that experience of harm or not having a role. In the midst of all of this is the psychologist had on me, which is the role of individual differences. We know there's a clinical relationship between parental anxiety and childhood anxiety, and it's a very normal feeling for someone that would want to see everything on that phone. We can understand that parent that would like to, in their gut, they feel something is wrong, and the best thing to do is to scan the phone, which is the opposite of having that collaborative conversation with the child. Hence the dashboard having an important role in facilitating that conversation. And
when it comes to risks, the role of the DPO as well is also to be involved in the risk assessments, data protection, impact assessments, and I wanted to maybe address head on some of the risks that no doubt many of you in the audience have read about TikTok. The risk of algorithms, the risk of inappropriate content, the risk of a filter bubble, and then of course the risk which we've already dealt with, which was spending too much time online, although I think we've touched on that. Many of us in the room might be guilty of that too. It's not just specific to children. But very briefly on the algorithm one, we know that the recommendation system, it's not unique to TikTok. It is part of the TikTok ecosystem, but like many of us, let's say if you read a book on Kindle and it recommends the next book to you, recommendation systems are now in our lives. But just one kind of proof point of how to safeguard this, especially for our younger users, is TikTok launched recently, earlier this year, a refresh feature, which means if you want to, when activated, users that will view content as if they were a new user. So it'll completely refresh the recommendation system. You can filter out content based on keywords or hashtags. You can say you're not interested. So all these different controls and mechanisms to, combat the algorithmic risk. Another one being the filter bubble. There's different strategies on how to diversify the content in the feed so that maybe it's perfectly fine to see, like a diet or a fitness video like once or twice. But if you see too much of it, maybe that could be triggering to younger users. So there's strategies deployed in order to diversify those recommendations. And finally, access to inappropriate content. TikTok introduced content levels. So many of us are probably familiar with when we were growing up as, on films and movies where there is a rating associated with it. So where a video is detected that it might contain mature content, for example, something that might be, frightening to more an early teen, TikTok will assign a maturity score that will be allocated to the video to prevent those under 18 from viewing that as part of their experience. So yes, to Darragh's earlier point, there are risks. I don't think we can shy away from the fact, but that there's ways and means to try and mitigate.
And again, this is not something that just TikTok does. I think many platforms have many of these tools, and we wanted to talk a bit about the implementation at a later stage. And in fact, this is what James was going to talk about, who is not with us. But in any event, I would like for us to take some time, and for you, Caroline, in fact, to outline to us. So we have heard certain concepts that we need to take into consideration. Best interest of the child. When we offer services to child online, you were, you just outlined, for instance, profiling, that was part of the offering you just indicated, so that we can identify the users, that we can make sure the appropriate content gets to the appropriate users. But there are a lot of implementation parts behind that. But all of this is enshrined in a global and very, very complex legal world that you have to operate in when you are trying to offer these kinds of services. Here in Europe, at least, we have the enforceable age-appropriate design code from the UK's ICO. We have the Irish Data Protection Commission is for the fundamentals. The French, the CNIL, has the digital rights of children. The European Commission has just released a European strategy for a better internet for kids and is working on their own appropriate design code. We have the DSA that has come out. We know there's more legislation coming out. And that's just here in Europe, and I'm deliberately including the UK in that. But we are thinking globally, as we said earlier. So, Caroline, if I can ask you, sorry, just to say, CIPL, we have a project also on children's data protection, and we issued a first policy paper and tried to show the complexity of this network of legislation that platforms have to deal with when trying to design with all the regulatory requirements and the best interest of the child in mind. And if you're interested in that, it is where else available online. But Caroline, from your vantage point of the DPO, when you have to advise, in this case, your platform as your client effectively, and this goes for your peers and on other platforms as well, what do you take into consideration when you operate globally?
Mm-hmm. Indeed, I think we're all maybe a little fatigued from all the different like we've had so much talk this week, so many different acronyms. There's so much so much on the plate. But today because there's so many, as you said, it's so complex, I was going to maybe focus in on two, which is something that's top of mind for companies right now is beyond Europe, global companies like Singapore and California are also developing their children's privacy legislation and guidance, and maybe just giving you a flavor of how a global company would approach kind of age-appropriate design code in the UK and by extension Europe, and then California, and then touch on as well the DSA and the impact that's going to have. So first with the California AADC, that's modelled on the UK, even by the very nature, we can appreciate that fact. But there are differences, and that's where it gets complicated for organisations that are striving to operate globally. So for instance, we know the UK AADC exists under the framework of the GDPR, whereas the California AADC is going to operate independently. So then the complicating factor there is that you can't then rely on, the definitions or the underlying regulatory framework, and there might be questions as to how you implement some as such. As well, I talked about data protection impact assessments because they're always top of mind for DPOs, and that definition is different in the California AADC than the UK one. Again, what that means is that as a global organization, the reality is you can't have a one-size-fits-all global DPIA, and if you think about the amount of changes, product features, rollouts, and so on, and all the need to document all of those, it means you're going to need to have carve-outs for, different regions. And that just makes it kind of more complicated on behalf of the organizations. And speaking of risk assessments, then just turning to the DSA, I think if we take a step back and you imagine all of the DPIAs that have been done under GDPR, which also include, children's data, which is our topic, plus all the pre-screen assessments that are done to actually determine does it meet high-risk processing or not, and then the best interest of the child assessments, and now you have the DSA risk assessments. And so companies are needing to make sure that they're consistent, that someone filling out a DSA risk assessment with more of a safety lens isn't rating something using a different risk methodology or rating than someone, on the other hand, that's doing it for a DPIA. So lots to juggle and take into consideration.
I think I find it interesting because you also talked about the California code, and there we see a challenge to the code on constitutional rights, and it reflects a little bit or mirrors a little bit discussions we are having here as well, which is just another layer to add on, which is the obligations to monitor for CSAM, which we all are supportive of, but there's a discussion here on how we do this without infringing too much on other rights, and this is the challenge in California is a bit reflective of that, of whether or not this infringes on other constitutional rights present, and so how do you add these layers of complexity when you are doing your risk assessments, and where does this sit with your company? What teams are involved, for instance?
Yeah, in a way, because there's so much market by market, divergence. It almost means as a company you need to think about having what is outlined in the law as well, like a floor of protection as a baseline, and then build on that. But when it comes to CSAM, and I think that's one that there is a DSA risk assessment required upon. Again, it will be everyone from the privacy team, product team, engineering. There's like content moderation team, like the trust and safety team. There's quite a lot of kind of functions involved in ensuring that the risks are documented and then how to mitigate.
Makes sense. And I think this discussion will continue the discussion around the CSAM is around encryption. Do we need to monitor, messaging, etc.? I think this is this will continue to keep, as I keep saying, and Lucas is going to hate me for that, but it will continue to keep us in shoes and handbags, because this is really a discussion that we will have to continue also when we think about how to implement these risk assessment and how to set up the systems internally, right? Yesterday, there was a panel here that talked about the practical implementations of all the legal frameworks that we have internationally, but from the legal practitioner side of view. And before the legal practitioner side come the product teams, the engineers, the game designers, and this was, where James was going to talk to us a little bit about how you start setting this up. How do you design your products? How do you implement all of this on a practical level? And if James were here, he would definitely start with age verification and age assurance questions, and the assessment of when do I actually need to do this? At what point do I as a platform obligated to start paying attention to children's rights on my platform?
Would you like me to weigh in?
Please do. Yeah. You're James now.
Just to take a step back, just on the CSAM one, I should mention that I guess as DPO, there are other teams that are more heavily embedded, sure, in the process. But I guess from my vantage point, it's more about whenever the privacy elements get triggered, and then that just for the benefit of people that aren't working, in the private sector or in organizations, then that's where decision-making paths and thresholds for escalation and all of that. It seems like the basics of doing business behind the scenes, but all of that becomes really important even in the privacy and safety world when you're, communicating that across peers. But yet, no panel on children's privacy would be complete without touching on age verification and age assurance. It really is, has been the topic of our time. And I'm happy to bring more visibility as to how TikTok has approached this. And I'm not going to spend too much time, because I think most people in the audience will have heard about, parental controls at the App Store level and the neutral age gate and so on. But just to touch on, how seriously the company is taking this, I can quote that TikTok publishes the number of accounts suspected of being underage on the platform. My understanding is it was the first and I think only company still to proactively do this. So in Q4 last year, there was 17.8 million accounts suspended globally for being suspected of being underage. Yes, that's a really big number, but it also, there's 40,000 safety professionals at TikTok whose job is to keep the platform safe, and they're also responsible for detecting these underage users. So it's really important that different signals and so on are utilized to make sure that underage users are detected. Having said that, if you suspend users' accounts, you also have to then give them the opportunity to appeal in case it wasn't warranted. So then there's a suite of solutions offered. For example, taking a selfie with your guardian or parent with a unique ID to by way of authentication, or even government-issued ID or credit card authorization. But the reason I emphasize suite of solutions, which was done in all of this was done in consultation with academia and research organizations and so on, is because there are very different views. You know, in some parents or some jurisdictions do not want ID to be to be required, even when appealing the account, and some alternatively they don't want to be in the photo with their child for the selfie. So and as well as credit card authorization, there's just a suite of offerings for whatever that parent or guardian is most comfortable with. I would just say a quick note on the reason I'm using the word guardian as well is when it comes to children, I think there's a variety of factors as well in the guidance is accessibility, like don't shut users out. And we also, another thing we're mindful of is the socioeconomic status, and not thinking that everyone has, an ID or a government issued ID that they could use. It very much differs, country by country. And background by background. But I guess just to wrap up, what I would say is that I think we're very mindful that there's still a lot more to do. There's still a lot of discussion needed. Like there's a lot. We might touch on codes of conduct later, but I think there's definitely a lot more kind of industry discussion on more innovation.
So this was more after the fact, and I was interested in quite practically how you start. For instance, let's say you develop a new product. How do you start setting this up with all of these in mind, with all of these concepts in mind that we've discussed earlier? My initial question was also, when do you have to start to do this? And so the ICO, for instance, in the UK had just a consultation out because the age-appropriate design code starts to apply when you assess that you're likely to be accessed by children. How do you even go about that? And the concept for that may differ through jurisdictions, but you have to. So if you're a game developer, for instance, and your game is available in different jurisdictions, which may have different age requirements for when you can consent, when you can decide on your own whether or not you want to be on there. So you have to sort of age gate differently and throughout different jurisdictions. How do you start setting that up on a platform quite practically? I'm sorry, you are the only platform left, so I'm looking at you, Caroline, but I will jump to Simone as well, because I know that she advises on this, at least on parts of design when she talks to
I probably can't speak to the details of how you approach this as a global platform. Wish I could. But I think what I'd say on the sort of introducing product features. So I guess what we would say, Darragh picked up on it earlier, is obviously consultation with parents and children is key. The age-appropriate design code in the UK is very explicit on that the need for consultation must be there. And I guess something that the UK went through when the code came in, the Information Commissioner's Office was really conscious of the fact that it didn't really have much of an avenue to talk to children and parents. It didn't have much heritage in speaking to families and children and young people and sort of representing their voices. So they went on quite a journey in terms of how do we communicate the code to young people? How do we communicate the code to parents? Because ultimately, if you introduce, a particular age verification or age assurance system or a particular product change for young people that might result in their access being restricted or changed in some way, they're going to experience that perhaps quite negatively unless you can explain why that's happened. And part of that explanation is the fact you have consulted parents and young people. But I guess, the point I'm trying to draw out is, as well as actually implementing the change and thinking about how you put those features in place, it has to be done obviously with young people, with parents, but also communicating those changes in a way that is likely to make them succeed in the eyes of those who you're trying to sort of benefit, I guess.
Yeah, we had, CIPL had a round table on age verification and age assurance a while ago, and there was a developer who said something interesting, because we know that children, the internet, the online world is a huge playground, right, or a carnival for them. And I think when we had our prep call, I mentioned that we had a discussion on one of our round tables where somebody from the GRANDE was present, and he described it as a big carnival, and sort of like, you have these signs, you have to be this tall to join the rides. But there may be children of different ages in the same family, and so the younger children are wondering, why can I not join the same ride that my older brother or sister is joining? And so children are, because they're savvy in technology as well, they will find ways around. And so it's something that you said that I find very important is how do we explain this to them, make it transparent and explain why this is in place. And so this particular developer who worked also on the code and in a very cooperative way, as you say, participatory, also with children, she said that the way they approach it is to look at examples in the analog world where this works, and to see if you can draw parallels from that into the digital world, to make sure that it works there as well, to ensure that they don't try to get around. I don't think you can absolutely exclude that, but I found that an interesting concept to try and take something from the analog world.
That analogy between offline and online is really helpful, isn't it? Because I think one argument we always hear about age verification and age assurance, I think we're moving beyond it now, but the argument about, well, children always find ways of getting around it. Well, countries have, rules around buying alcohol. They have rules around buying cigarettes. There's nothing to stop a child from asking their older sibling or someone else to go and get it. It doesn't mean we say that there shouldn't be rules around, restricting access to those kind of things. So I think, that's a sort of an example of, we can't let perfection be the enemy of the good here. And that, we can draw those parallels, and we shouldn't have, treat this particular field as an exceptional case, I think.
There's also quite a debate around how explicit should you be about the joining age? Because on the one hand, people say, well, of course you need to tell everyone like very, very directly and explicitly the joining age to keep them off the platform. But then on the other hand, like finding ways of getting around it, sometimes companies are resistant to make it too explicit because they believe then, that the child will, give you what you're looking for. But one thing that TikTok is doing on this is every day this week when I was walking here on the way to the conference, I walked past a billboard outside one of the metro stops, and there is, it's changing its sign every 30 seconds, but TikTok has signs there explaining what the joining age is, telling parents and other, people walking down the street, whether it's a guardian or a trusted adult for the child. Here are others like controls and features and settings, and companies can create all of these, all this goodness, but in the end it only matters if they're actually used. And so that's one way of trying to, in someone's daily life, like do more education on the joining age.
I think that's there's also, the difficulty for, I imagine, the platforms in general. There are different devices on which these are accessed, and it depends on the service, how you access it, and where does the age gating need to happen? Where can it happen? And there are shared accounts, etc. This is why I think it's very important to have this collaborative a way of where the families jointly understand how this works, and the children are aware what the parents are doing, but and the parents take a role there as well. I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty, and it's not necessarily something that we can solve, I think, because there are many conflicts that arise in this context. But I want to spend the last few minutes before I open it for questions just to look into the future a little bit as well, to see, and you alluded to that a little bit, Caroline, already, asking about or talking about codes of conduct. What is, for all of you, your wish list for the future? How can we as a community, civil society, academics, industry, regulators, policymakers, what do we need to do? What do we still need to achieve here to create a safe space for children, but also make it possible for those providing the services to actually do this comprehensively? Darragh?
It's a hard question. When we were prepping, we did use I think the carnival imagery is very helpful, because the word and the concept of play is so important for the child's development in particular, and that's also a balancing act that we're seesawing. How can we have playful by design as well as having all these advancing measures? And there is no easy answer to it, hence my phrase that what's the least worst suite of options as it relates to age verification, for example. There were lots of debates in Ireland about the digital age of consent, and it potentially being a red herring and an interruption to the debate that we're having right now. But looking to the future, I mean, I always start with the question, like, hypothetically, what imagery do we want to see when we think of the internet? Is it a carnival? Is it more of a classroom where the parents have a bit of a view outside? Is it entrusting it in other actors to roll out and advance? Is it AI? What is and if you ask young people, is it going to be the same as what a younger child might say versus what a policymaker might say? So we need to start with that question. We're all guilty of saying the usual thing: we need multi-stakeholder collaboration. It's my favorite last sentence of every paper. And it's true, we do. I guess we can be more creative with it, I suppose. Transparency was mentioned as well. I think the role of evidence is also advancing. We're seeing nice industry, academic collaborations and NGOs as well, and that needs to continue as well, and embedding the child's voice at the centre of that. That's the starting point.
Yeah, for me, I think I totally agree with Darragh there. And I guess, what we've just been talking about the need to communicate changes, it picks up on a point for me, which is that in the UK, at least, I'd be interested to hear about beyond the UK, but in the UK, the way we think about children and their relationship with technology is quite removed from situating that in terms of how we think about families and parents and schools. It's like, the government department responsible for that is very separate from the services which young people and their parents encounter every day. And I think that's a bit of a problem, and it points to this wider point about tech being in its own sort of silo. The reason I point to that as a problem, for example, in the online safety bill going through UK Parliament at the moment, parents are referred to as affected persons, and that reference is made 14 times in 250 pages. Children are mentioned 404 times, and that ratio just seems off. So I think there is something around joining up the way we think about, for example, terms of service. What's the way to make terms of service accessible and intelligible to children? It probably involves directing them to speak to their parents about it. So this is a bit of a tangent, but essentially I think there is a bigger point here around, thinking about technology and children in the context of their whole lives, rather than just we're going to regulate the child's user journey as if it's in its own little silo.
And I'd like to, pick up on something, Darragh was saying about the phrase that's used too much, like multidisciplinary, but it's more from a practical sense. It's just the reality is the more people that are in the room, the more discussion there is, and then, somewhat longer it takes to achieve the output. But that's just something to consider, whether that's internal, given there's more need for that, like inside companies, but also, like having a seat at the table with all the different stakeholders. And then I briefly touched on it earlier, but it's just something to, maybe if it's not too candid, like to call out, maybe it's my first time at CPDP, and maybe to call out, I guess, the elephant in the room is that, like, they're definitely, I have picked up this week on, like, quite, it can sometimes seem quite stark, the polarization of views. And sometimes in business, when there's conflict between, let's say, one person and another, or two different teams, often a business technique that's said is like, assume positive intent. You can still have diverging opinions, but, you know, assume that you both want to, you know, achieve the best outcome. And sometimes, and maybe this is very naive of me, as a DPO and being more kind of independent in nature, but that I would love us to see going forward, kind of maybe more of that assumption of positive intent, that all the different stakeholders want to advance children's rights, want to advance children's privacy, and work together.
I think you can export that into the whole privacy discussion and any of the big topics. But I like that a lot, assume positive intent. And this is certainly something that at CIPL we are very much in favor about. I never find it useful to have to be this entrenched, but you need to have your listening mode on. And if we as a community want to find solutions to these very big and very important topics, this is children's data protection, but I can probably say the same thing about data transfers, which, you know, we still haven't solved, and maybe it's time we did. But I think, from my point of view at least, I think because these are discussions that we have to have globally, because the services are accessed globally and are available globally, but there are these differences. I think we need to find commonality on an international level as well, and work through international organizations to try and find a common standard that we can all maybe work from by finding commonality. Again, I'm drawing parallels to the data transfer discussion, where Japan certainly has been trying to do that, and the OECD has been trying to do that. And so maybe this is a space where this is possible as well. I would like to open it to questions, if there are any, before everybody else is leaving the room. Right there.
Hi, Baron Soga, Tech Freedom. Keneal issued a report last September that was very skeptical about age verification and age assurance mechanisms. I'd like to hear your thoughts about the problems that they identified and their conclusion that it wouldn't be possible to find a tool that was simultaneously privacy protective and also effective enough to qualify under proposed legal standards. So do you think that that's right? Do you think that something has changed since their report? And if they are correct in a technical assessment, what do you think that means for how age assurance requirements should be written?
Will I kick us off?
Sure.
Thank you very much for the interesting question, and it is very thought-provoking. I think that we've already said in today's panel that there's a lot done, but there's still a lot more to do. When it comes to, I guess, the statement, is there no solution that can be found that's privacy preserving but also effective? I guess I would go back to the example given around the underage appeals solution, where it's true to say the reason there's 3 and the reason there's a suite of solutions is because we couldn't find one in consultation with all the different stakeholders and with the users themselves and parents and guardians that people were satisfied with. So by offering a suite of solutions, that was then found to be, satisfactory, and people had different options. So I guess I would extrapolate that out and say that, maybe I think if there was a one-size-fits-all solution, we would have found it by now. And that probably, we didn't actually get into much detail on it, but there is quite a lot of work being progressed in codes of conduct, so that at the EU level, but also there is like an Article 40 GDPR-style code of conduct being developed at the industry level. And that's where I'm hoping we will kind of tease out that suite of solutions.
I think again, as in many of the topics in privacy, there isn't just one tool that does it all, and the magic wand, and so it will always be a suite of tools. And like you said, there's several approaches to it, and I think that will be the same in this space. It has to be, because you are perhaps in some of these situations stuck between a rock and a hard place. You need to age gate certain things. You are not supposed to process more data than is necessary, and so you need to take all these steps. And so maybe, and there is a step-by-step approach also for certain. We're coming to the risk assessments, right, where highest risk, most processing, lower risk, it trickles down. But I would agree with you, Caroline, that there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. At least I haven't seen it yet. So I don't know if that helps at all. It's probably, but that's where we are right now. Any more questions? Nope. Okay.
Either the panel blew people away, or it's very late on a Friday, and people have had a lot of data protection insights and knowledge throughout the week.
I have a question for you all, maybe. Again, looking to the future, how do you consider new technical developments? How do you build the assessments about their risks when they are still in development? And here, in particular, when it comes to quite disruptive technologies such as, and I mentioned ChatGPT because it's the thing to mention. In particular, when we may see it in services that are likely to be accessed by children. The GRANDE in Italy, for instance, listed children's data protection as one of the reasons why they initially blocked ChatGPT. And it now has an age verification and parental consent process added. And I'll start with you, Darragh and Simone. Have you started looking at this kind of technology that is maybe the next step, the next inflection point when it comes to how this may be dealt with children? I'm thinking that they are very susceptible, or more susceptible perhaps than most of us, to the outcomes, and maybe don't quite understand the limitations of it. And so is there any research that you have done already, that you've started in this?
I think the field of serious games is a really interesting one, because of course children are inherently playful, curious and inquisitive, and therefore the demand and the way they use these types of technologies, it actually shapes the next iteration of them. So I think there's a myth that sometimes that children are targeted by kind of big tech or big gaming companies, and there's issues there as well, of course. But children drive the shape of different sorts of games, the hunger for VR, augmented realities, and how they use them has shown, and there's plenty of research on cognitive benefits, educational benefits, and it itself being a collaborative tech with parents. Mm-hmm. With fellow peers, with building communities. And this often is just in the undercurrent of the debate. It's happening right now in schools, and we don't really see it nor feel it, and therefore it can't directly inform how we advance the debate here. But I would be quite optimistic in terms of the technologies that children will leverage. Will they understand the inherent risks? I mean, I wrote down earlier the journey that we took to get do you accept or reject all cookies, and the debate that we had for years about this, and now how we've just, in the spirit of behavioural change, we've designed out us even thinking about, do I want to accept or reject? And we need to be careful of the unintended consequences as well, because I don't think we understand the risks, yeah, or the unintended consequences. So it's just a roundabout way of saying that we rather than kind of overthinking this, that we need to be with children and parents as we design the policies. And it is a case, as per the last question, it is a case of sometimes moving the problem around whilst reducing it, which we see with a lot of kind of crime policies as well.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think, I think the technology is moving on so quickly, and it's really easy to then slip into thinking, oh, what's our response? We need a new response. Whereas actually, often the risk, not always, but often the risks, the risks are familiar. They're the same, or they're at least very similar to things that have come before. If you think about the metaverse, for example, what people are talking about there, the sort of kind of experience of, bullying and abuse in a metaverse environment might be somehow heightened or amplified. But actually, does the response need to be fundamentally different? Not always. And I think sometimes, as a sector, maybe we get a bit caught up on what's the new thing coming around the corner, what's the new technology. Whereas actually, when we speak to parents and young people, we track their views every 6 months. Always top of list in terms of their concerns is bullying. Always. We haven't cracked bullying, we're always thinking about the next thing, and actually the risks are familiar, they're not always new, and we haven't actually got to grips with the tech we have. So we kind of need to think about that rather than just always thinking about what's coming around the corner, I guess.
And even one question on that, sorry to interject, is what's the level of risk that we're all happy to live with in knowing that we can't design out risk? Again, we'll get different answers from different stakeholders, and that's always something we're chewing on as we think of the next wave of tech.
Yeah, Gerlach?
And to chime in, I think the point around transparency and explainability, is very apt. In my role, I often encounter, as I mentioned at the very beginning, we're striving to be the voice of the user in some of these discussions we're having internally. And even before we encountered, generative AI or different AI practices, there was still, like, how do you explain the privacy policy? We, used plain English Academy to try and help us do that in language that was clear and accessible to younger users. But to Darragh's point, how do you do that in a way like now with the new wave of technologies coming, and also just for the lawyers in the room, in a way that they then don't think that it takes away the actual legal meaning of the word, which then the regulatory authorities will pick up on, and it's a really difficult kind of seesaw.
Yeah, I think Darragh had the creative use case for ChatGPT at the beginning of the panel, right? Take your privacy policy and have ChatGPT rewrite it in the voice of a 7-year-old. So maybe that's one application. Anyway, with that, unless there are any more questions, I think I'm going to wrap us up. So you don't even have to hold up your sign. I think we're more or less right on time, and I release you to your Friday afternoon. Thank you very much. Thank you to my wonderful panel, also for filling the one gap that we had, unfortunately. And we'll see you next year at CPDP.